I chose to look into the Australian Indigenous cultures and their way of life. My purpose for picking these peoples was I find a great interest in Australia in general, and any opportunity to find out more, I'm all for it. Another interest that drew me into researching the Australian Indigenous peoples was the number of similarities that they have to Canada's Indigenous peoples. While I was researching, I found that there was three very important objectives and I think are critical to knowing about these peoples. The first is their background and history, the second is their land rights, and the third is their huge comparison that they have to Canadian Indigenous peoples. I saw these as important because in order to know anything about a cultural group, you must know where all their teachings come from and what put them in their way of life that they're in today. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples refer to themselves as Aborigines. The culture takes up approximately 2% of the population in Australia, with a number of 400,000 people. In the beginning, their ancestors migrated from parts of Asia over 30,000 years ago and have been there ever since. Much like any Aboriginal groups, the Aborigines have a strong spiritual belief of storytelling and art that tie them to their land. The Australian Indigenous peoples diverge into two groups. The first group is referred to as the Aboriginal peoples, and they have migrated and inhabited all of Australia and have interacted with all the peoples there. The second group is called the Torres Strait Islanders, and they have lived in many islands between Australia and Papua New Guinea. The Aborigines show great respect for those who have come before them and often start speeches and prayers with "We acknowledge the traditional owners of this land." This is referred to as the acknowledgement of the country, which is there as respect for the first comers of the country that have been there for 50,000 years. The dream time is the idea of a referment to the beginning of time when the ancestors rose below to form all that is beautiful in their land. It is with this that the Aboriginal peoples believe that their ancestors metamorphosed into the earth where they remain and live spiritually. British ships arrived at Bonny Bay in January 1788 to establish a penal colony, the first colony on the Australian mainland. In the century that followed, the British established other colonies on the continent, and European explorers ventured into the interior. Once this had all happened, the Aborigines had already occupied and utilized the entire continent. James Cook arrived in 1770. This marked the beginning of the end of the ancient way of Aboriginal life. Cook was told that this land was uninhabited, and he was told to get consent from the natives that were there if it was occupied. Upon his arrival, he declared that this land and property of the British king at the time known as King George III, and continued to ignore the fact that Australian Indigenous peoples had already well populated the land. From this point on, the treatment of Indigenous peoples and their respect declined drastically. Between the 1940s and 1950s, the Australian government changed the policy of Aboriginal peoples to one of assimilation. This means that they were told to live a life as the non-Indigenous peoples did. The government told them that their culture could not exist. This is similar to the residential schools in Canada. The young Indigenous children were beaten and abused in order to follow the European way of life, and if they were to choose otherwise, consequences would be made. And in the 1960s, the policy changed to one of integration. As a result of assimilation, most Aborigines were to join into white, rural, and urban communities. This meant that they were exposed to new diseases that their bodies simply could not control. This resulted in a massive depopulation and disappearance of many Aboriginal tribes. The land and property rights fueled a very important civil rights movement in the 1970s. The Aboriginals spoke strongly about equal rights, specifically for their property that was taken from them at the time of the British settlement. The Land Rights Act was passed in 1976. It became a very important asset to many tribes and territories. There was 5 important movements that were made in order to reach the rights that they deserved. The first was the Wakala Bark petitions. The second was the Wave Hill Walk-Off. The third was the Mabu case. The fourth was the Wake Division. And finally, the Native Title of 1993. This resulted in the assist of buying and helping to maintain land for Indigenous peoples and the regrowing of the population. They bought over 550 properties stretching over 6.1 million acres. As we know, in Canada in the 1900s, there was the residential school movement that was essentially to take the Indian out of the kid. This resulted in a brutal beating and abuse of the Catholic Church. So this happened in Canada. So what happened in Australia? In Australia, over 10,500 people were taken and removed from their homes to be placed on several missions. This was an act of child welfare in Australia. There was about 50% of our Aboriginals taken and roughly 51% of Australian people taken. Although in Australia not all peoples were enslaved were Indigenous, but it was still an act of discrimination and cruelty, much like Canada's residential schools. This all happened on January 1st, 1830. Aboriginals were forced to move into captivity in exchange for food, clothing, and protection. The Aborigines were placed on Finlay's Island inside the Bass Strait, where they were exposed to many new diseases and essentially damaging the Aboriginal population. The purpose of residential schools was to eliminate all parts of Aboriginal culture. The children were to cut their hair, dress in uniforms, all the boys and girls were kept separate. Often siblings were rarely in contact with each other. With this happening, weakened their family ties for the future. Due to all the discrimination in Australia, there has not been a treaty making honour of the Aboriginal peoples. This is because Australia is a Commonwealth country and does not have treaties with their Aboriginal peoples. Many Indigenous peoples have cited many treaties, and it has made their best shot of bringing them symbolic recognition. Earlier this month, there was a passing of the bill for a treaty that was approved in Victoria's lower house of parliament. Many territories are on board and trying to make their own separate actions. What is a treaty? A treaty is an important formal agreement that is able to define the relationship between the country's government and their Indigenous peoples. A treaty can include specific issues like protecting rights and acknowledging the wrongs that have been done in the past. It is also a form of agreements on health and education. In Canada, out of respect for our Indigenous peoples, we have lived on this land for thousands of years. Canada has treaties to form a journey of reconciliation between the Indigenous peoples and the non-Indigenous peoples. The addressing of the long history of colonialism and scars that were left from the past. By forming treaties for the Aborigines, it will help be able to heal the relationship between the Aboriginal peoples and their government. It will be able to help them heal from the tragedies that their ancestors have been through. The Aboriginal peoples and the first comers, within most of the land, they are the least respected. By forming treaties, it will teach the peoples to realize that Aboriginals have done and what they have done for them. Many Indigenous peoples around the world, no matter where they are in the world, are consistently discriminated against by the settlers that have arrived there after themselves. We often look at Indigenous peoples as stuck in the past, or unwilling to adapt to society, and often put stereotypes on them. But how would we react if someone came into our country that have lived there for years and then telling us that our way of life is wrong and change it. I know for a fact that we would not be very happy. In the past, there are many acts of discrimination of Aborigines being forced into captivity in residential schools. These are just examples of little things that have happened to Indigenous peoples that make a big impact. All right, thanks for listening, guys.